great to see everyone here this evening. And if everyone wants to go and take a seat. First, I want to welcome everyone to Congregation Beth Yeshurun. It is an honor to host people throughout the community. What a beautiful statement we're making tonight to the Jewish world. The people from different congregations, different denominations can come together and to study Torah. It's a beautiful statement that we're making, and I love that we're doing this. And I want to thank my colleagues at Brit Shalom who really came up with this idea last year, and so we're continuing it this year, and then hopefully next year we'll go back to Brit Shalom, and then maybe other congregations in the future, wherever they may be. But as long as we can all come together and study Torah, it really is terrific. So I want to first thank all my colleagues for having an opportunity for coming here at Beth Yeshurun to teach Torah tonight. I want to thank my staff members, especially our program director, Jennifer Rosenzweig, and our executive director, Andy Berger. Let's give them a big round of applause. They always do such a terrific job. So someone just said to me when I was walking in, they said, you know, Rabbi, the real key tonight isn't if I can stay up till 11:30. It's will every rabbi stick to 18 minutes. That's the real test tonight. So we will see. I don't know. But we will see what happens. But anyway, do me a favor, though. While I talk first, put away the study packet, because I don't want you to look at what the text I'm going to be teaching just yet, and you'll see why as we go through it. But let me begin. Now, years ago, you may have heard of this true story, but I had an Orthodox colleague. His name was Rabbi Benjamin Blech. He was a rabbi at Yeshiva University. He was small Orthodox congregations. And the true story is that he invested in the stock market, and he turned a relatively small nest egg of about $50,000, and within a few short years, he turned it into $7 million. This was a rabbi, and he was setting up trusts for Yeshiva University, and he was setting them up for his 4 children and 9 grandchildren. He was living nicer than he ever had before. And despite a long and successful career, Rabbi Blech said he never felt better. He never felt more intelligent. He was on top of the world. Then as quickly as he made it, the market crashed. Rabbi Blech lost all of that $7 million. All the millions gone. The trust he was setting up, all wiped out. Over. Now, of course, on the ladder of emotional importance, rabbis, by definition, are supposed to put material losses far below spiritual gains. That's the ideal. Yet the rabbi admits his ego was shattered. He tells us, he explains that he was embarrassed to even look his wife in the eyes. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a failure. And I know Rabbi Blech is not alone. One of the most powerful examples I know was a gentleman named Adolf Merkel. In 2007, he was one of the richest men in the world. And he was the richest man in Germany with a net worth of $12 billion. But a year later, almost overnight, he lost several billion dollars on one stock market move. To make matters worse, he desperately needed some cash to pay off a huge business loan. But in 2008, banks weren't loaning money to anyone. So what did Merkel do? Search for new financing, cut his expenses, sell some companies at a loss? No, when he realized he had lost $3 billion, it was no longer the richest man in Germany, he wrote a suicide note and walked in front of a speeding train. It's a tragic irony. His family discovered only a few days later that the loans he had sought had come through, and his companies were going to be saved. Did Merkel die because he lost money? Or did he die because of what money meant to him? For Merkel, money was an identity. It was a source of significance. And the loss of his status as the richest man in Germany was too much to bear. He felt like a failure, even though he still had $9 billion in his pockets. You might be thinking, what a waste. But it may be a little too easy to judge this man. How often have we attached our identities at some level to how much money we have? Probably more than we'd all like to admit. Rabbi Black now admits that his wife would ask him why he was calling his stockbroker 20 times a day. He responded, I needed to know what I'm worth. I needed to know what I'm worth. Yes, even a rabbi can base his self-worth on his net worth. It's understandable. I admit there are times I do it as well, especially now that I have 2 kids in college and one going to law school. Despite our great blessings, and we are very blessed, it's not always easy. No matter how hard Lisa and I work, there are always more expenses, car payments, tuition bills, and of course, those never-ending Amazon bills. Not to mention there are always things we want to do. Take vacations, buy new clothes, or go out to a nice restaurant for dinner. And it does seem more challenging to do so than ever before. It also doesn't help that there are always others who seem to have more. Those neighbors, who constantly seem to be buying nicer cars, larger homes, or going on more exotic trips. Neighbors who seem to be able to do it all. And when we can't do it, it's easy to get down, feel judged, feel like something isn't right. Yes, with all the blessings we all have in modern-day America, it's very easy to base our self-worth on our net worth. And when I do, when I lose focus, when I think about the fact that there will always be things we cannot do, when I let the fact that I haven't made $7 million in the stock market get me down, I turn to my faith, the wisdom and values of our beloved Jewish tradition. I often turn to one book and one man's legacy, Viktor Frankl, in his masterpiece, Man's Search for Meaning. I believe it's one of the most important Jewish books ever written. As some of you may know, Viktor Frankl was a well-respected Austrian psychiatrist who survived 4 concentration camps. How did he survive? He recognized that he couldn't change his circumstances while in the camps. Rather, he could only change his inner strength, which could liberate him from the torment of his daily existence. Even in the darkest and cruelest of all places, Frankl could still use his psychiatric skills to uplift countless others who had lost the will to live. In those camps, he used his God-given talents to help others. In a nutshell, in the midst of hell, he dedicated himself to counseling. And his counseling often worked by giving hundreds the will to live. He did so by inspiring his fellow victims to believe that no matter the present circumstances, their lives may not be finished. If they could just survive, they could still fulfill their life's goals and dreams in the future. And his reassurance gave countless Jews a reason to survive until the war was over. Even in the camps, Frankl found meaning. And in the concentration camps, Frankl put his personal foreground, not what he lacked, but what gave him meaning. He possessed that incredible belief that said, let me not be defined by what happens to me, but by the good choices I can still make for myself and for others. Way beyond money, way beyond power, way beyond material possessions, he still found significance. And the Nazis showed Frankl that everything in life could be lost at any given moment. And he recognized that possessions, acclaim, and money don't bring happiness because those things are not permanent. Frankl understood that only one sense of meaning could be everlasting. Thank God he survived. Because after the Holocaust, Frankl defined his life-saving work as logotherapy. It's an incredible life-saving therapy still used across the world. Let me share with you in my remaining moments a little bit about logotherapy. So you can open up the study packets, and thank you to Jennifer Rosenzweig for putting these packets together and for my colleagues to sending everything in. So let's go to that first box right there where it says Man's Search for Meaning. These are from pages 153 and 154 from his book. And this is what he writes. He says, let me explain why I've employed the term logotherapy as the name for my theory. Logos is a Greek word that denotes meaning. Logotherapy focuses on the meaning of human existence as well as on man's search for such a meaning. According to logotherapy, the striving to find a meaning in one's life is the primary motivational force in man. That is why I speak of a will to meaning in contrast to the pleasure principle on which Freudian psychoanalysis is centered. It is a characteristic of the American culture that again and again one is commanded and ordered to be happy. But happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. One must have a reason to be happy. Yes, logotherapy is based on the premise that our main motivation for living is our will to find genuine value in life. And I love what Frankl says to us. From decades ago, he's still speaking to you and me, and perhaps more so than ever before. He wrote in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but I think his words are never been more important for an America where depression and anxiety have never been higher. He writes, each of us has the freedom to find meaning, even in the most difficult of circumstances. His philosophy revolved around the emphasis on meaning, the values of suffering, and responsibility to something greater than the self. Only if one encounters those questions, one can be happy. Now, before we get to box 2, let me share with you a little bit more, because I think this is important. We hear a lot about Freud, another good Jew. Well, an okay Jew. But it was almost an inversion of the work of Freud. Freudian psychoanalysis had encouraged people to think about their very early pasts. Frankl taught people to build a future, or more precisely, to hear the future calling to them. Hear the difference? So after the Holocaust, Frankl lived a long and good life. He gained worldwide recognition, and he passed away in 1997 at the age of 92. In so many ways, he was a prophet. He identified the cause of existential modern-day frustration is the belief that life is only good when we have everything we desire. But he knew, and he asserted, that when someone lives only for that money and that fame or that material success, he inevitably becomes entwined in a web of meaninglessness. Not only because things are impermanent, but also because they are only distractions that give us a temporary feeling of pleasure. They don't really change our state of mind, our sense of self-esteem. And material, possessions, money, there's never enough. So let's go to box number 2. In box number 2, we read, life is a task, Frankl used to say, and added, the religious man differs from the apparently irreligious man only by experiencing his existence not simply as a task, but as a mission. He or she is aware of being summoned, called by a source. For thousands of years, that source has been called God. So some questions for you to ponder tonight and throughout Shavuot in the days ahead. How does Frankl understand the difference between living life as a task and living life as a mission? There's a difference, and Frankl would want us to remember that. And do you approach your own life as a mission? If not, what other word would you use to describe your approach to living your life? In many ways, as we celebrate God's giving of the Torah tonight on Shavuot, and we are reminded of God's mission for all of us as Jews, I think this question is paramount for all of us as Jews and as human beings, and especially as modern-day Americans. Are we living our life as a task or as a mission? And is there a source or inspiration that guides you in how you try to live your life? And finally, that last box, you may know that May is Jewish Heritage Month, and it's also Mental Health Awareness Month. Now, I don't know if that's a coincidence or not, but let's look at this last box. One should not search for an abstract meaning of life. Everyone has his own specific vocation or mission in life to carry out a concrete assignment which demands fulfillment. Therein he cannot be replaced, nor can his life be repeated. Thus, everyone's task is as unique as his specific opportunity to implement it. I love that idea, that Jewish idea, that every single one of us were born into this world for a reason. It's an important message for you and me, and I would say even more so for our young, because they need to be reminded in the competitive postmodern world in which they will go to college in and graduate and try to find positions, they need to be reminded that there's a reason why they're here. And finally, why would meaning, even in suffering, help a person keep their humanity? As Americans, we believe that everyone has the right to the pursuit of happiness. Do you think meaning and happiness are the same? If not, which one do you think is more important and why? And of course, now we know how Frankel would answer that question. And how can finding meaning help a person maintain his dignity? So with that, I want to wish everybody a good Yontiv and a Chag Sameach. It's such an honor having you here at Beth Yeshurun, and I'm looking forward, along with all of you, to learn from my amazing colleagues this evening. So without further ado, I'll call upon Rabbi Adrian Scott. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Rabbi Strauss and your clergy team here at Congregation Beth Yeshurun and all of the staff. I am not Rabbi David Lyon, but I am very honored to serve under Rabbi David Lyon, as I have been doing for the past 18 years. Unfortunately, Rabbi Lyon is a bit under the weather, and so I am grateful to fill into his slot a little bit earlier. I have the privilege each fall and spring to welcome new candidates into our basic Judaism class at Congregation Beth Israel. The semester's long course often begins with three important pillars of Judaism: God, Torah, and Israel. The ancient rabbis thought a great deal about these three concepts, and when the Siddur, our prayer book, was constructed by the rabbis, they were careful to incorporate the themes represented by these pillars as well. Tonight, we will explore these pillars a bit further. We will look at how they relate to our understanding of God, our liturgy, and finally, how each of them directly relate to three prominent women in our Tanakh. God, Torah, and Israel represent a paradigm of foundational elements for our belief. Each of these three ideas are central to what it means to be a Jew. Our duty and obligation is to cultivate a relationship to God, Torah, and Israel continually throughout our lives. We are always learning and exploring the potentials. The rabbis took these notions of God, Torah, and Israel and laid on top of them three other and perhaps more malleable concepts: creation, revelation, and redemption. God is the source of all creation. The Torah, given at Mount Sinai, was the source of the moment of revelation, and the Israelites became a people at the time of their redemption from slavery in Egypt. It all comes together in great harmony. By narrowing our focus and perspective on how to connect to the creation of the world, we can emulate God. The universe was established to create order out of chaos. Each day we strive to put ourselves in order too. Jewish rituals and practices can be a wonderful guide for us. Shabbat is a time of the week when we savor, divided into three distinct parts. This is amplified during our sacred moments, which help us to reconnect with our ancestors and traditions. Acknowledging revelation is also important as finding our connection to God. By understanding the mitzvot we are to uphold, we deepen our understanding of what was revealed by God on Mount Sinai so many generations ago. Specifically, tonight is our Shavuot Pilgrimage Festival, when we mark our people's receiving Torah and the 10 Commandments from God. These commandments continue to guide us even today. They help us understand more about our relationship between God and amongst ourselves. Our interpretation guides us in making the best choices we can, even as we are endowed with free will. Often, we are asked, Isn't it enough simply to be a good person? Do I have to be religious? In Judaism, we are guided by these 10 commandments and many others. They help us to live our lives with balance, integrity, and humility. And yet, none of this would be possible without the gift of freedom, represented by the community of Israel. There is never a moment when we don't acknowledge the incredible blessing of being redeemed from Egypt. While specifically we observe this during Passover, truly, each time we pray, reflect, and study, we are always aware of the gift of freedom. We must maintain the important Shalshelet HaKabbalah, chain of tradition that began so many years ago. The rich heritage and legacy that has come to us must continue to guide our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. When we think about our holidays and special moments in our calendar, we witness this paradigm too. Each of our holy days and festivals provide opportunities to help us focus on being partners with God, observing mitzvot, and living as a sacred community connected with Jews in Israel and throughout our diaspora. Tonight's program and service is an example of how we bring God, Torah, and Israel, creation, revelation, and redemption into our hearts, our homes, and our sacred spaces. So where did the rabbis find these themes in our liturgy? What prayers speak to these ideas? After all, liturgy is a way that helps us connect. It's accessible and portable. By embracing our Siddur, our prayer book, we can find greater meaning to our own personal thoughts and feelings. Now let's examine the prayers of the Baruch Hu, Shema V'Ahavta, and Mi Chamocha, and see where there might be some overlap. First, the Baruch Hu prayer is all about our relationship with God, the ultimate source of creation. The first formal prayer in our service helps our community get called to order. Everything in the service up to this point is about preparing for Baruch Hu. We raise our voices together as we praise Adonai, to whom our praise is due now and forever. To be fully invested at the moment the Baruch Hu is uttered, we must arrive for worship, prepared to be ready when the time is right. The paragraphs following the Baruch Hu speak to our sense of gratitude for all that God has created. Next, we look to Revelation and arrive at our prayers of Shema and V'Ahavta, which focus on our collective call to action. We first find these words in Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, offered by Moses, as he summarizes all that the Israelites must know when they enter the promised land and move forward with a new leader. When we recite Shema, we are bearing witness to God's oneness now and forever. Hence the larger ayin and dalet in the verse of Shema, which spells aid to bear witness. The prayer that follows is the V'Ahavta, where we speak of loving God. If our faith must endure, then it must be practical. How do we express that love? We teach words of Torah to our children. We must be aware of Torah both within our homes and outside our gates. There is never a time when the values contained in Torah and its teachings should stray from our lips or from our actions. When we are focused on loving God in these ways, then we are honoring our faith. The mezuzah we hang on the doorposts of our homes is a continual and consistent reminder of these important values. Finally, we arrive at the Mi Chamocha prayer, which is the ultimate expression of our people's redemption from slavery. Recalling the story of our ancestors, we appreciate this prayer, which asks the question, who God is like you among all the other gods that are worshipped? The answer, of course, is Ein Kamocha. None is like our God. Often set to an upbeat and lively melody, This song speaks to our ancestors who witnessed firsthand the splitting of the Sea of Reeds. As they made their way from slavery to redemption, they created their community, B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel, and ultimately became a nation. We continue to share in the beauty of that miracle, which inspires our own steps today. Once we have identified God, Torah, and Israel through the frame of creation, revelation, and redemption, and their liturgical counterparts, it becomes easier to see how each of these concepts relate to archetypes represented by female biblical leaders found in our Tanakh. Too often, significant women in our tradition are overlooked, despite their profound and lasting impact on how we observe Judaism today. Let's examine this a bit further. In the first book of Samuel, chapter 1, found in the Nevi'im, or prophets section, we read about Hannah. Hannah was unable to bear a child, and so she prayed for God to grant her a son. Hannah's prayers often lifted up as a model for individual and spontaneous prayer. The beauty of her prayer was that it was uttered very quietly and with such intense kavanah, or intention. It wasn't simply mouthing words we don't understand or that we've memorized. It was even perceived by Eli the priest, who was watching this unfold, that Hannah appeared drunk. Yet this was far from the case. Hannah needed to offer a prayer from deep within her heart. She found what she needed and allowed herself to utter the words. Hannah reminds us that we must always find a balance between keva, the fixed words, and kavanah, intention, in every situation. Too often, we want to offer prayers in Hebrew because it feels authentic and holy. But when it isn't our first or second language, it can be especially difficult. Prayer should be about becoming one with the words of our soul. Rabbeinu Bachya, a medieval rabbi and scholar from Spain who lived during the 13th century, not to be confused by Bachya ibn Pakuda, a Spanish commentator from the 11th century, is best known for his commentary of the Hebrew Bible. He connects the events of Hannah's prayer to the story of Jacob and Esau. The words, Vayomer asu belibo, he said to himself, are used by Esau after his blessing is stolen by Jacob and he begins to plot his revenge. Bachya points out that this phrase is used to remind us of the wicked are always prisoners of the dictates of their hearts, whereas the righteous are in full control of their hearts. He points to a handful of verses speaking of wicked people in which the Bible uses the same expression, Vayomer asu belibo. For example, in the book of Psalms and the book of Kings, Rabbeinu Bachya teaches that the word belibo must be contrasted with the expression el libo, to his heart, as distinct from bilibo, in his heart. When you speak to your heart, you are the boss. When a voice speaks in your heart is the boss. This is why we find in Hannah praying the words, V'Hannah hi medaberet el liba, and Hannah, she was speaking to her heart. This phrase, el libo, is also used by God in Genesis, providing us with a powerful reminder that we should always find ways that prayer can speak from within our hearts. Often, it may mean that prayer is best when it remains silent. On Shavuot, it is customary to read from the book of Ruth, found in the Ketuvim, or writing section of Tanakh. And Ruth's experience is the archetype of what the Shema and the V'ahavta are all about. It focuses on a story of a leader who chose to become Jewish despite her tragic circumstances. What's the connection between Ruth and Shavuot? The Sopharim, an 8th century Palestinian text, teaches that there are many reasons why Ruth and Shavuot are linked. There's the harvest time, the season when the 10 Commandments were received, and King David, an offspring of Ruth, died on Shavuot. Though Ruth's husband dies, Ruth clings to her mother-in-law, Naomi, who changes her own name to Mara because she has become embittered after the loss of her husband and 2 sons. Ruth's response to this difficult moment is perhaps the best known section of the entire book. Entreat me not to leave you or to return from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The book of Ruth is an important statement of loyalty and faith. Ruth becomes a Jew by choice and maintains her commitment throughout her days. She doesn't compromise or long for an easier path. Celebrating the giving of Torah at this significant time reminds us of our deep connection with our history and our people. As the Midrash of Ruth Rabbah teaches, the book of Ruth was transcribed to teach the magnificent rewards to those who practice and learn to dispense chesed, or loving kindness. Ruth is also a person of action. She is a doer who relies on her convictions. Her story provides an important model for us to emulate today. Miriam, Moses and Aaron's sister, is perhaps the best known female biblical leader. Miriam is credited as leading the women in dance and song following the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, as the Israelites experienced their personal redemption from Egypt. And so, her archetype is about the Israelites themselves, who become the nation of Israel, and she represents the paradigm of redemption and the Mi Chamocha prayer. Miriam, or Miriam, is always associated with water, as her name literally means mistress of the sea. As the sister to both Moses and Aaron, she plays a vital role in gathering the women and children to offer their collective expressions of joy to God as they embrace their own redemptive experiences. As we shared earlier this evening, Mi Chamocha is always an integral part of our worship service and experience. Water is also a life force and is very important in our tradition. The rituals of hand washing and immersion into the mikvah remind us of water's ability to purify and prepare us for important moments. The concept of redemption also has a healing component, and so Miriam is always associated with our prayer for healing, especially as Moses prayed to God for her to be healed. There is a beautiful poem about Miriam the healer by Alden Solovoy entitled The Chief Physician, which explains Miriam's significant and important place in our tradition. It reads, "While Moses was appointing judges and creating courts, while Aaron was tending the altar and leading priests, Miriam was training doctors and creating clinics to tend the wounds and the hearts of the people. Only a healer could find the hidden water in the desert wilderness. Only a healer could dance with passion in the narrow space between life and death. For the healer shall surely heal, and the prophetess shall surely bring blessings." As we reflect on the important principles of our faith, God, Torah, and Israel, and their liturgical counterparts of the Baruch Hu, Shema V'Ahavta, and Mi Chamocha, may we also be mindful of 3 strong female leaders of Hannah, Ruth, and Miriam. On this eve of Shavuot, Zman Matan Toratenu, the season of our gift of Torah, may we continue to be guided by their wisdom. Let these legacies envelop us with strength, integrity, and blessing as we are guided and supported by these sacred teachings in this moment and in all of our days to come. As together we say, Amen. Thank you so much. Now it's my honor to invite Rabbi Renon Teller to share his words of wisdom.
I want to thank all my colleagues, my rabbinic colleagues and cantorial colleagues who are here, and all of you who are here for celebrating Shavuot with us here at Beth Yeshurun. And of course, our host, Rabbi Brian Strauss. Rabbi Strauss, everybody. My friend and mentor, thank you for inviting us and hosting us. I'll go first. You repeat after me. You ready? Are you ready? All right. Yeah. Ya la 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 la, ya 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 la la la. That was very good. That was much better than I expected. All right, so let's one more time. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Ya la 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 la, ya 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 la la. Okay, my turn. Ya la la la, yamba, ya la. Yalla, yalla, la, 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 yalla, yalla. Now we know the whole song. Okay, ready? So I'll sing it once through, and then we'll really sing it. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yalla, la, 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 yalla, 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 la, la. Ya la la la, ya la la la, ya la 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 la, ya la, ya la, ya la 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 la, yamba, ya la. So we've been sitting for a while. Why don't we stand up for a second? Please rise. Ya la 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 la. Ya la la la, ya la la la, ya la la la, yamba la la, ya la la la, ya la la. Everybody stretch. Ya la la, ya la, ya la la, ya la, ya la la, ya la, ya la, yamba, ya la. Everybody stretch your neck a little bit and then be seated. Chag Sameach, everybody. Thank you for indulging. Why is that funny? I want to thank Kenner Levine because Kenner Mark Levine, this idea germinated. It started as a seed in Kenner Levine's office. And now look around, and so thank you for Kenner Levine for everything that he does to make Judaism a relevant and energetic spirit, and for this. When COVID hit, I took on the role of rabbinic savior of emotional distress. I was 24/7 a digital rabbi, all the while dealing with my own isolation and my own fear. It was super unhealthy. My parents had made Aliyah to Israel pre-COVID, and just after the second immunization came out, my father caught the Delta variant, and he died. The funeral took place that night in Israel without me. My mother diagnosed with Parkinson's and dementia. My sister has stage 4 breast cancer. I spun out and my mental health was in bad shape. All of this is to say that over the past few years, I've endured my share of suffering. In fact, I consider myself sort of an authority at this point on suffering. And so we're going to study a little bit about Jewish responses to suffering. And what's interesting about this is also that up until COVID, I lived a pretty charmed life. So all this is new to me. And so this evening, we'll share some texts and ideas that I've leaned on through this process to enable me to stand before you today in health and in strength. And so let's open up our packet. It's like on the third page. It has my name in the title, so you can recognize it. The first step is that I know I'm not alone in this, right? Ein lecha adam b'lo yisurin. There is no person who goes through life without afflictions. Once upon a time, there was a person who couldn't get through their grief. Stuck, went through Shiva, went through a year of mourning and 2 years of mourning, couldn't get through it. They go to the rabbi, and the rabbi says, tell you what, I have an idea. I know how to cure your grief. Find me some pepper, a bag of pepper, from a home that has known no grief. I said, okay. So off he goes, knocks on the door next door neighbor. Have you known grief? He said, yeah, my sister. Have you known grief? Yeah, my daughter. Have you known grief? My uncle. You wouldn't believe it. Have you known grief? All around the neighborhood, he couldn't find one single home who had not known grief. And so he goes back to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, I tried to find it, but I couldn't find a home that has known no grief. And the rabbi turns to him and says, aha, there you go. Ein lecha adam b'lo yisurin. There is no home that has known no grief. And that was a solace of comfort and healing, and he was able to move on in his grief. And so the rabbis understand that grief is universal. Suffering is universal. And not only is it universal, but in fact necessary and essential for three gifts. Shalosh matanot tovot natana kadosh baruch hu l'Yisrael. There are three gifts, beautiful gifts that God gave to Israel. V'chulan lo nitanan ela al yedei yisurin. And they were all given through suffering. Wouldn't have happened without suffering. And these are they: Torah, Eretz Yisrael, and Olam Haba, and the world to come. In order to receive Torah, Israel, and the world to come, you need to walk through some suffering. It's necessary for us to go to some degree of suffering, teaches our Talmud, in order to receive these gifts. There can be no gift of this magnitude without suffering. Right? And so not only is suffering universal, not only is suffering necessary and essential to receive gifts of this magnitude, but in fact our rabbis teach, fortunate is the person for whom the Torah is the source of their affliction. Ashrav le'adam, how lucky is the person who suffers from the energy of the Torah. And so that's a confusing and strange statement, right? But our rabbis teach it's necessary to acquire that kind of wisdom, to acquire that kind of magnitude of gift. There needs to be some suffering involved. And we'll explain that in a moment. But the rabbis asked us to embrace some suffering in order to live a life filled with empathy, ethics, moral nobility, and fulfillment requires some suffering. So that's our introduction. Right? And now let's unpack what to do with that suffering, knowing that it's around, knowing that it's actually wanted at some level in the rabbinic construct. Let's see what we do when we go through that kind of suffering. The first of the three rabbinic concepts that I chose for tonight, the first one is silence. Silence is clearly not a very healthy expression of grief or suffering, But it's here in our tradition, and perhaps instead of the word silence that we're going to see, we can use the word acceptance. So Aaron, the high priest, suffered when God killed his two children, Nadav and Avihu. They were offering a strange fire before the Lord in the Mishkan, and it was unacceptable to God. A lot of different explanations for why this happened, how this happened, should it have happened, but the bottom line is Aaron was suffering. There came forth a fire before the Lord and devoured them, and they died, lifnei Adonai, and they died before the Lord. Rashi, our premier commentator on the Torah, writes, Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. And Aaron was silent in response to this tragedy and his suffering. And Rashi writes, Kibel shar al shtikato. Right? Sheket means quiet, right? We all know that. And from Hebrew school, when our teachers were yelling at us, Sheket. And he was silent, and he received a reward for his silence. And so the rabbis look at this text in the Torah and say, you know what? This was a worthy, worthwhile silence. This silence deserves a reward. He's not the only one, right? Our next text is from Talmud Bunachot. Everyone following in the text? Right, good, yeah. Moses suffered in his sorrow, and Moses suffered when he went to visit Rabbi Akiva. And so there was a time travel story in the Talmud. And he went to the classroom of Rabbi Akiva. This is Moses traveling through time. And he ended up watching Rabbi Akiva die by the hands of the Romans. The story in the Talmud tells about Moses' time travel. First, he starts in his classroom, then he travels a little bit further, and he's having a conversation with God as he time travels to Rabbi Akiva's life and now his death. Moses went back to the land of the time travel and saw that they were weighing Rabbi Akiva's flesh in a butcher shop after he was tortured to death by the Romans. Gruesome, gruesome suffering. Moses said before God, Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe, this is Torah and this is its reward? How could this possibly happen? For a man who studied Torah all of his life, did mitzvot, loving kindness and chesed, this is its reward? And God said to him, Shtok, be silent. Kach Allah b'machshava lefanai. This is what was supposed to happen. So be quiet. Right? So quietude, this sort of acceptance, is one of the ways our rabbis deal with this kind of intensity of suffering. Job, of course, right, is the man who suffers. I am of small worth. What can I answer you? I clap my hand to my mouth. Right? There's Job suffering in silence. Be quiet, Job. This is how life works. Elie Wiesel, the death of my father. The survivors of the Holocaust are aware of the fact that God's presence at Treblinka, or Majdanek, or for that matter, God's absence, poses a problem which will remain forever insoluble. We will never figure out the reason for suffering. We will never figure out how to deal with this kind of intensity of suffering. There is no answer. There are no words. That's response number one. Response number two, traveling on in our texts, introspection. Right? So what are the ways we deal with suffering when it comes along inevitably? Lo aleinu. It shouldn't. No one should ever suffer, right? But unfortunately, it's part of the human condition. Each of us in our own way, may it be of lesser and lesser degrees for me and for everybody. But when it happens, right, one of the opportunities we have is to look inward. Sometimes our instinct, inclination, is to look outward into the world, to look upwards, so to speak, to God. Why did this happen to me? Right? Kashem shetzarich adam le'amin beHashem yitbarach. Just as a person is required to believe in God, so too are they afterwards required to believe in themselves. Right? We have belief in God as part of our fundamental, essential Jewish experience, and we have belief in ourselves that goes along with that. We are partners with God, and so when we experience suffering, surely we can turn to God and outside of ourselves with anger and curiosity and wonder, but just as important, we must also look inside of ourselves. Next text. There's a lovely Hasidic story of a rabbi who was always told that his people that they studied Torah, it would put scripture on their hearts. That's the quote. The scripture on their hearts. And one of them said, why on our hearts? Why not in our hearts? Why does Torah stay on our hearts? Why not the preposition in our hearts? The rabbi answers, only God can put scripture inside, but reading sacred text can put it on our heart. And then when your heart breaks, the holy words will fall inside. Right? If our heart isn't broken yet, we can't incorporate the wisdom. It requires a crack in our hearts in order for us, for the wisdom to get inside, to get deep inside of our hearts. Right? And so it's an opportunity for introspection. When that kind of heartbreak happens to us, we can imagine the wisdom seeping into our hearts, into our souls. There's an offbeat writer, his name is, and a poet named Charles Bukowski. Maybe you know Bukowski in the room. Anyway, yeah, one or two. I'm not recommending him, but I was an English major for a while. And he had his share of suffering. He looked at people who never experienced suffering as not having lived a full and genuine life. He used to refer to those people with disdain. And he used to say, see that guy over there? He hasn't had a toothache in his whole life. The toothache symbolized suffering, right? And if you haven't had a toothache, you haven't really lived a full life, right? So that kind of heartbreak is necessary to deepen one's experience and their soul. And here's a strange one, right? Talmud Brachot. Amar Rava said, and some say it was Rav Chisda, they're not sure who it was, but someone said, if people see that suffering has befallen them, they should examine their actions, right? If suffering's happening, right, and this can lead to some strange behaviors, so we don't want to really emphasize this one too much, but the point is, look inside. That's one of the responses. The first one was silence, acceptance. This is the way the world works. And here's the second one, right, which is introspection, an opportunity to look inward, to inculcate some of the lessons that are happening. And why do we do that? It leads to our third one. How are we doing on time? Growth. When our hearts break, when we experience suffering, it's an opportunity for growth. And perhaps, we can think about when bad things happen to good people, right? And Rabbi Harold Kushner, Zichrono Livracha, we can respond through growth, right? By being more empathetic. We'll see a few different ways of doing that, but notice that his Rabbi Kushner's book, a lot of people misquote it, and they say, why? Right? Bad things happen to good people, right? But it's not. It's when, right? How do we respond? What happens when that happens? What do we do? How do we respond? And here's a way of responding: growth. Midrash Tanchuma. The Holy One does not confer greatness upon a person until he tests them in lesser things, right? It shouldn't be big things. No one gets tested with tragedy, but little challenges along the way. Only then does he elevate them to greatness, right? And so some of these challenges that we experience, not the great ones, right? But some of these lesser challenges are opportunities for us to grow, to say, okay, been there, done that. That was terrible, right? What can I learn from that? And then when you see it happening on the horizon, you can avoid it. And if it happens to some degree again, you develop some resilience. Rachel Adler writes, the only moral response we can make to suffering is to do all we can to alleviate it. So when we experience suffering, the only thing we can do is try to alleviate it for ourselves and for others. In fact, only in being present to the suffering of others do we become completely human. When we suffer, we become more tender and more sensitized to the suffering of others. It's upon us to relieve suffering wherever the ravaged face of the other lifts itself to yours. Even when we ourselves are suffering, in that same moment, we can leave ourselves open to compassion and to hope by the practice of lament and by a life of active caring. There's a response to suffering, right? To realize that our souls have been tenderized and to be there for people when we see, right? We become more aware. We become more sensitive in the world when we see someone's face and they're just not looking right today. You can see it in their eyes. You can see it in their mouth. You can see it in their shoulders. Right? Once we have experienced that kind of suffering, we have this suffering radar, right? And so when we experience that suffering, let's use that to intensify our sensitivity for the others around us. And Frank, if we bear all the suffering, and if there are still Jews left when this is all over, then Jews, instead of being doomed, will be held up as an example. An example of what? Right? An example of resilience, an example of hope, an example of growth, an example of seeing just a glimmer of hope, seeing an opportunity in the worst of times. Suffering breeds resilience. Suffering breeds strength and character. And so here's a strange quote. Does anybody know Courtney Love and Kurt Cobain? Do we know about that story? Kurt Cobain was a rock star and the creator of the Seattle grunge rock music and the whole style, like flannel shirts, right, and the jeans and all that cool stuff in the 90s. He died of an overdose. He was suicidal, and it was coming. It was impending. You could sort of see it happening. And he suffered with his mental health and the demands of his public persona. His famous wife was Courtney Love, sort of like the Yoko Ono to John Lennon. And after he died, this is what she said. Kurt Cobain had a lot of German in him, some Irish, but no Jew. I think that if he had a little Jew, he would have stuck it out, right? Because Jews have known suffering. Jews have wandered throughout history, suffered as a people, as individuals, and presumably we've integrated some coping skills, some coping mechanisms into our DNA. Resilience, humor, of course, right, is how we survive. Community, our grief Shiva practices, our prayer system to help us stick it out. Right? And let's be proud of that. And Viktor Frankl writes, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds meaning. Right? Wisdom and empathy come through suffering. A week after my father died, my sister tried to console me by saying, you know, this experience is going to make you a better rabbi, right? Now you know what it's like to lose a parent, and so you can empathize more easily. Oh man, my poor sister, this is like a week after. I was so angry, right? It was way too soon, and I told her that. She was implying that there's some good that will come out of this pure tragedy, that somehow it'll be good for me in the long run, and it hurt. However, 2.5 years later, I still have a hard time with the concept, but it happens to be true. After I had children, I had more empathy for parents. After my kids became bar and bat mitzvah, I had more empathy for others going through that experience. Kids off to college, right? More empathy for leaving the nest. And now I have more empathy and understanding because of the way I mishandled my own father's death. And now I can guide others, especially rabbis and colleagues, towards a more meaningful, healthy journey through grief. So when my father died, I inherited all of his sermons, and they were typed up on this like delicate typing paper from the 60s and early 70s, his edits in handwriting on every page. The first sermon I picked up was a sermon he gave on Tisha B'Av on the topic of suffering. He opened his sermon with this poem. I'm not sure who it's from, but it was in quotes, so it wasn't him. Life's delicate harp vibrates with many strings, blending the melodies of mingled strains into a paean of rhythmic harmony. Not merely gladness soars on music's wings, not joy alone intones the soul's refrains. Pain, too, must chorus in life's symphony. And he closed his sermon with this story. Am I still 18 minutes? No. Seems like longer. All right. Oh, that's true. They ceded their time to me, I guess. All right. Once upon a time, a little boy from the Midwest was visiting his grandparents in Cape Cod. He was still learning about the world, and his mind was open with curiosity and wonder. And he was walking on the pier and began to notice that everyone around him kept saying a word that this little boy didn't know yet. He hadn't learned it. The word was wind. Everybody on the Cape was talking about the wind. You know, sure needs some more wind today. When's the wind going to blow? Which direction is the wind blowing? Eventually, the little boy found an old sailor and tugged on his shirt, and the sailor looked down at the child, and the boy said, "Mister, can I ask you something?" He said, "Sure," said the sailor. "What's wind?" The old sailor pondered the question. He gazed far out into the sea, his eyes squinting, his face weathered by the wind. Finally, he looked down at the boy and he said, "Look, kid, I can't tell you what the wind is, but here's what I can tell you. When the wind blows, I know how to hoist the sail." Right? When my father died of COVID, I suffered from unresolved, untreated grief. Even more complicated was navigating my journey through grief as a rabbi. I didn't know how to be a mourner. I only knew how to be a source of consolation. And I had no rabbi to turn to. I got lost at sea, the wind whipping. And it took me a while to learn how to hoist the sail, to learn how to navigate my way back. My friends, may we know no suffering. And when we do, may we navigate the journey with a degree of acceptance. May we look inside of ourselves with deep introspection. And when we get some distance and when we get some perspective, may we recognize the opportunity for growth. Together we say, Amen, Amen, Amen.
So let's take just a 2-minute stretch break, and we'll start Mariv in just 2 minutes. So if everyone wants to stand, rise from your seats. And our prayer books are the Siddur Lev Shalem. And we start on page 39. And we'll start with the Baruch Hu on page 39.
Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai Vorach Le'olam Vaed.
Baruch Adonai Melech Haolam, Asher Barav Ariv Aravi.
Umay v'yom v'layla mavdiot beinu v'layla Adonai tzvaot Shemo. El chai v'kayom tamid yimloch aleinu le'olam vaed. Baruch atah Adonai HaMariv Aravim. ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים, ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב עמו ישראל.
Page 41.
Shema
Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם
בשבתך בביתך ולתך בדרך ובשכבך ובקומך וקשרתם להיות על ידיך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. We continue silently, page 42. Yeah, be sure to give it to
Adonai Elohechem Emet.
Emet. Page 43.
ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליכם, ושבני ישראל לכנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם, מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נהדר בקודש, נורא תהילות, עושה פלא, מלכותך ראו בניך, בוקע לפני משה, זה אלי, ענו ואמרו, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ונאמר, כי פדה אדוני את יעקב, וגלו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני, גל ישראל.
Page 45.
ושמור תתנו ואינו לחיים ושלום את אביעד עולם, ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך, ברוך אתה אדוני, הפורס סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ועל ירושלים.
Amen. Page 46.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה,
Amen.
ועל מד יברך חירותי וימליך מלכותי,
Please rise.
וחייכון ובמכון ובחיית וכל בית ישראל, בגלה בזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם עולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה שמי לקודשה. בריחו לילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה ותושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן ועלמה ואמרו אמן.
We now daven silently. The silent Amidah for this Ma'ariv begins on page 306. We'll continue now with the Kaddish Shalem, page 54.
יתגדל ויתגדל שמי רבה, ואלמדי ורקירותי, ואמליך ומלכותי, בחייכון ובחנך כל בית ישראל, בגלה בזמן קריב אמרו, אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך, לעולם עולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישלח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל, שמי לקודשה. בריחו לילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דמירן מעלמל ואמרו, אמן. תתקבל תלותהון ובתלכו ישראל, כל דם עוון וישמעאל ואמרו, אמן. יהי שלום הרבה מן שמעאל, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו, אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו, amen.
And now please remain standing for the Kiddush for Shavuot, page 79.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachavani b'kol ha'am, ורוממני מכל לשון, וקידשנו במצוותיו. ותיתן לנו אדוני אלוהינו באהבה, מועדים לשמחה, חגים זמנים לששון. את יום חג השבועות הזה, זמן מתן תורתנו, מקרא קודש, זכר ליציאת מצרים. כי באנו ובחרת, ואותנו קידשת מכל העמים, ומועדי קודשך בשמחה וששון חינכתנו. ברוך אתה אדוני, מקדש ישראל והזמנים. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה. לחיים.
And now let's continue, and we turn back to page 56 for the Elenu.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל החמונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומורדים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא, שהוא נטע שמיים יעשה לעצמו שבקרוב השמיים ימלך. כן נקרא לך אדוני. ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום האחור, ביום האחור, יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד.
Now we invite all those in mourning to remain standing for the words of the mourner's Kaddish, which is found on page 58. Yitgadal v'yikadash shemei rabbah, Biama Divrak Yurute, Viamlik Machute, Bechaye Echon, Viom Echon, Chaye, de Kol Beit Yisrael, Ba'agalav, Bizman Kariv, Viemru, Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabba Mevorach, Leolam Ome Amaya, Yitzbarak, V'yishtabak, V'yitzba'ar, V'yitroma, V'yitnaseh, V'yitadar, V'yitaleh, V'yitalal, Shemei de Kudusha, B'richu. Leila min kol berkata v'shirata tishbechata v'nechemata damiram b'yama v'yimru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shamaya v'chayim aleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Osei shalom b'mromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'yimru amen. So thank you, Cantor Goldman, for doing a beautiful job laning. We go from one wonderful cantor to another. It's my honor now to call upon Cantor Mark Levine.
So I've seen a pattern, and I don't want to break a pattern. So in the spirit of Clark Kent, I'm going to remove my tie. Shavuot, marking the revelation, as we heard throughout the evening, is a time of the establishment and the reconnection of Jewish identity. That identity is dynamic, and thus, this is a moment of personal and collective struggle with what it means to be a Jew today, and how that identity could and should manifest. Questions about Jewish identity have surfaced publicly in recent years. In the last 2 years alone, comments made by Whoopi Goldberg and George Santos have helped place the age-old dilemma of defining a Jew at the forefront. Whoopi raised the question in reflecting on the Holocaust as to whether Hitler's attack on the Jewish people had a racial nature. That's a conversation for another time. And George Santos, well, you know. And so tonight I want to take a somewhat whimsical look at Jewish identity, a look through the lens of my favorite superhero, Superman, and to explore what has been his de-Jewification in recent decades. Superman is one of the most well-known mythical figures in the world. In the timeless words of the 1950s series, he is a strange visitor from another planet who came to Earth with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. And an aside, for those who are accustomed to the scope of Superman's powers, where he's capable of such feats as flying into a blazing sun, freezing a lake with his super breath, or lifting mountains up, you may be surprised to learn that in the original comic book incarnation, his powers were far less expansive. He could hurdle skyscrapers. He could leap an eighth of a mile. He could raise tremendous weights, run faster than a steam engine, and nothing less than a bursting shell could penetrate his skin. A far more limited superhero, but an example of how we have learned to understand Superman in a different way. In the period of the birth of the comic books, the team of Jerry Siegel as writer and Joseph Schuster as artist had been working together to create successful comics since they met at Glenville High in Cleveland. Among their new superheroes' powers, the notion of being impervious to bullets had a powerful personal dimension for Jerry Siegel, because Jerry's father, Mitchell, died as a result of a nighttime robbery at his store. Siegel never spoke about it publicly, but the earliest version of Superman, of which we know, appeared shortly thereafter, and it was illustrated with a drawing of Superman swooping in to stop an armed robbery. Additionally, we see a level of compensation. Compensation as both Jerry and Joe were physically small and uninterested in any kind of physically competitive sport, And on top of that, Jerry was very nearsighted. Both were Jewish, and both were highly influenced by that Jewish identity. I want to take a quick look at the story of the Exodus, and I want you to listen for the echoes. Moses is sent off in a small vessel by his parents to save him from the death and destruction facing his people. He's then raised among people to whom he is really an alien, but who do not suspect his secret identity. And he grows up to be a liberator and a champion of the oppressed with the aid of miraculous superpowers displayed in some truly memorable action scenes. Sound at all familiar? Who knows? Who knows what lurked in the memories of young Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster when they created their tale of immigrant baby Kal-El's arrival on Earth? Can it really be a coincidence that Kal-El's original Kryptonian name sounds an awful lot like Kol-El, the Hebrew words for the voice of God, perhaps an allusion to Moses' role as a prophet in the story we just spoke of? Is it just a chance that he's sent from an old world, Krypton, that's about to explode to a new world, Earth, a scenario which could readily be seen as standing for Europe on the verge of self-destruction and America with its promise of a new life? In a memoir published later in life, Jerry Siegel acknowledged that he was strongly influenced by the rising anti-Semitism in the world, and that the biblical Samson was indeed a prototype, a role model for his Superman character. But there's more to Superman than meets the eye. Once inside the comic book, the reader readily discovers another less heroic character, Superman's alter ego, Clark Kent, the mild-mannered reporter. Why? What's the logic of this subplot? What in the psyches of its creators motivated the introduction of a Clark Kent character? When one considers the nerdy role of Clark's personality, one has to ask, why on earth would Superman want to perpetuate such a masquerade? The answer lies in the psychology of Siegel and Shuster's imaginary world, which only worked if, at the same time that we readers who know who Superman really is, also know that in the world within the story itself, people saw him only as Clark, a timid, socially inept, physically weak, clumsy, sexually ineffective, quasi-intellectual who wore glasses and apparently owned only one blue suit. In other words, Clark was the traditional Jewish nebbish. But little did others really know. Jewish men had only to tear off their clothes, rip off their glasses, to reveal the surging Superman underneath, physique and prowess fully revealed by those skin-tight blue leotards. Jerry Siegel describes his early inspirations. He wrote the following. He wrote, "As a high school student, I thought that someday I might become a newspaper reporter, and I had crushes on several of the attractive girls who either didn't know I exist or didn't care that I existed. It occurred to me, what if I had something terrific? What if I had something special going for me, like jumping over buildings, throwing cars around, or something like that? Then maybe they'd notice me." And that night, when all the thoughts were coming to me, the concept came to me that Superman could have a dual identity, and that in one of his identities, he could be meek and mild like me. He could wear glasses the way I do. The heroine, who I figured would be a girl reporter, would think he was some kind of worm. Yet she'd be crazy about this Superman character who could do all sorts of fabulous things. In fact, she was really wild about this Superman guy. And a big inside joke was that the fellow she was crazy about was also the fellow she loathed. Superman is the hero from the Ellis Island tale, personified as an undocumented alien who's been naturalized by the ultimate American couple, the Kents. Immigrant baby Kal-El had been sent to Earth by parents when they, along with his entire culture, were annihilated in the great Holocaust of the destruction of his home planet, populated by what were said to be highly evolved inhabitants. In the context of his time, this story echoes that of the Kindertransports, via which the Jewish children were evacuated to safe countries, leaving behind their parents. The ridiculed personality of Clark Kent that he sheds when he casts off his street clothes is a gendered stereotype of Jewish inferiority. In Eastern Europe, the ideal of Jewish masculinity emphasized brain, not brawn, scholarly rather than athletic prowess. And from this, one stereotype of the Jewish culture emerged, a people dedicated to education, but detached from physical labor. The guy you hired to do your accounting, certainly not to fix your car. Superman exists in response. Superman exists to counter the notion that strength or manliness and Jewish identity are incompatible. This kind of negative perception had been used as a weapon against the Jewish people for many centuries. Writer Arthur Koestler was a member of a Jewish fraternity in Vienna around the turn of the 20th century. He wrote that the members of the fraternity felt that they needed to prove that Jews could hold their own in dueling, in brawling, in drinking and singing, just like any other people. And not accidentally, we know of another proficient duelist of the time. You know him by the name of Theodor Herzl. At times, we Jews embrace this sense of an inferiority. We embrace the sense of the unmanliness. Self-deprecating jokes like the following. Two Jews are walking through a neighborhood one evening when they notice that they're being followed by a couple of hoodlums. One of the Jews turns to the other and says, "We better get out of there. There are two of them and we're alone." In our Superman tales, Clark Kent's Jewish-seeming nerdiness and Superman's non-Jewish-seeming hypermasculinity are presented as two sides of the same coin, super nebbish and superhero. Clearly, there's a Jewish underpinning to Superman. In recent decades, however, Superman has been increasingly whitewashed. The steady and the persistent sanitizing amounts to what is a de-Jewification. I'm making up my own words, this is great. And Superman's ascension to saintlyhood, and it brings with it a transformation in Clark Kent, moving him from sideshow character to center ring star. In the 1990s, and in the first decade of this century, episodes were produced that it made it seem like Clark Kent was the real person and Superman a costumed identity that he was assuming. His heroic persona, his strong values appeared to be imparted to him not so much by his Kryptonian heritage, but rather by his adoptive parents on their small farm in Smallville. In other words, small-town Christian values. This is significant. It's significant because one can see the different ways of relating to heroic characters when looking at the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. Christian texts present biblical heroes as saints. They're perfect. Jews do not. Our biblical figures are not saints. Indeed, Englishman Duff Cooper quipped that most of the stories of King David must be true, for no people would ever invent such a flawed character to be a hero. Treating Superman's biography as the life of a saint, as the life of a squeaky clean good doer, sacrifices the original Jewish sensibility that created a more human character into a Christian sensibility of saintliness. And by the time we reach the 2006 film Superman Returns, Superman's de-Jewification has proceeded so far that he's not only the all-American, he's being even resurrected as a Christian god. In one scene, what is essentially a spirit form of his father Jor-El stands with his son, looking over the earth and tells him, "You can save her, son. You can save them." Then Superman steps out into space, arms outstretched, his body in the shape of a cross. And he doesn't leave that position. He doesn't run to save Lois. He doesn't run to save us. He stays in that position until the camera is sure you caught it. Superman has become our savior. Verbal and visual cues presenting Superman as Jesus appear throughout the film, ranging from the repetition of the film's guiding mantra that the Father becomes the Son and the Son becomes the Father, to Superman in countless Christ-like poses, to Superman receiving a piercing stab wound that replicates that of Jesus on the cross. And the Smallville TV series was just as much an example of Christian imagery. The most memorable image from that opening episode shows Clark in a similar, again, in this crucifixion pose, suffering and hung up on a scarecrow pole out in the cornfield. Superman's voyage from Krypton to Earth was originally a tale of an infant's rescue from his world, which was about to perish in a great conflagration. It's about saving the child. The 2006 film reverses that Jewish contrast between Krypton and Earth. Now we hear the Father telling Kal-El that he sent his only son to Earth to save us. A complete reversal of the original Superman tale. This is language right out of the Gospel of John, including a declaration that these humans lack the light to show them the way. The Jewish understanding of Krypton as the old world, Europe about to self-destruct, and Earth as the new world, America with a promise of a new life, is replaced in this film by a Christian coding of Krypton as paradise lost and Earth as the scene of life after the fall. So what do we take away from this? As we gather here tonight on the eve of the giving of Torah, the eve of the acceptance of a covenantal relationship with the divine, and as we explore our Jewish identities, we pray. We pray that it be God's will that we follow the opposite path, that we instead further our Jewish identities, that we embrace our Jewish identities with all of the values you're hearing and have heard from the rabbis here tonight, while at the same time portraying both scholarship and strength. Ken Yehi Ratzon, Chag Sameach.
Just think of me as Clark Kent here. It's very hard. Thank you, Mark. It's very hard to follow Superman unless you're a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. So maybe think of me as Peter Parker. Okay, so we're going to talk about something completely different. And I do have a handout in this text over here somewhere. Angels among us. Ah, yes. Look for the 10 Commandments. After all, that's the subject of the evening. Different 10 Commandments, a different version of the 10 Commandments. This is my version of the 10 Commandments of civility in public discourse, something we really don't need anymore today at all. So just by way of background, I wrote this about 25 years ago when I was still in rabbinical school. Not this particular version of it, but the United Synagogue, we used to pass resolutions every year at their annual conventions, and then they'd have implementation programs, and they had passed a resolution about trying to promote civility in public discourse, and then they turned to the rabbinical school and said, find a student to write a paper on this. And I was selected. So I wrote a paper on Jewish tradition in civility. So then, many years later, I thought, I could turn this into a 10 Commandments, shorten it and kind of, bullet point it. And so that's what this is over here. So this is 10 Commandments of civility in public discourse. And 25 years ago, believe it or not, when they passed that resolution, they thought the world was going to come to an end. We were so nasty and brutish in our public discourse. 1997. Needless to say, we've solved that problem. Okay, so anyway, so these are statements. I kind of color-coded it and kind of played around with the fonts a little bit to highlight what I'm trying to get at. And I've given you the references for every single one of them. Microphone has a mind of its own. Okay, so let's take a look at them. The very first one is one of the most important commandments in the Bible. It is love your neighbor as yourself. That comes from Leviticus chapter 19:18. The famous Rabbi Akiba, who we heard about just a little while ago, Rabbi Akiba said this is the most important commandment in the Bible. The most important commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. I should add that there's some discussion, if you follow on the internet or you Google it or whatever, you'll see who counts as your neighbor. Is it just Jewish neighbors or non-Jewish neighbors? And I would argue that we're really talking about anybody, Jewish, not Jewish, from the planet Krypton or wherever you're from. You should love your neighbor as yourself. I'll save that for another discussion. You can ask me or text me, and I'll give you sources for that. But even if you didn't think love your neighbor as yourself applies to everybody, there's a further commandment that's not well known, just a few verses later, and it says you should love the stranger as yourself. So take your pick. It just seems like we're supposed to love every human being. So now in blue type, I suggest some thoughts about this commandment. So remember, when you're getting into a discussion with someone you disagree with, that even when you strongly disagree with this person, he or she is still your neighbor. We still share the same planet. And somehow we have to figure out how to get along. So I know, by the way, these commandments, if they were easy, we wouldn't have to state them. Right, so in the middle of a heated conversation, it's not going to be easy to think, oh yes, I'm supposed to love you, because I really hate you. But you have to do that. You have to reframe your mind and say, you know what, this person is my neighbor, and I need to find a way to love this person, even when they have ideas that I think are completely crazy. That's number one. Number two, what is hateful you should not do to others. Now, many people will recognize this. This was Hillel's statement about the most important thing in Judaism. So you may remember that in the Talmud, Hillel and Shammai was considered the more conservative, the more difficult person to get along with. And Hillel was considered the friendly, outgoing, reasonable, nice guy. And 3 people who want to convert to Judaism first go to, for some reason, I guess they didn't know the personalities of these 2 people. They always go to Shammai first and get the door slammed in their face. And then they go down the street to Hillel, and he invites them in and treats them nicely. So the one that's relevant here is a person wants to convert to Judaism, but he wants to know everything he needs to know about Judaism while he stands on one foot, where we get this expression that we talk about all the time in the Jewish world, well, I'll give you the version where I stand on one foot. In other words, used to be how we would say the elevator speech, right, or the soundbite. This is my soundbite answer to your question. So that's what this gentleman wanted to know. What do I need to know about Judaism while I stand on one foot? And Hillel said, what you find hateful, don't do to your neighbor. The rest is commentary. Go and study. Now, it's interesting. Hillel is a rabbi, or he's a proto-rabbi. Notice his name isn't Rabbi Hillel. I think rabbis maybe came about a generation or so later, but he's clearly one of the preeminent teachers of his generation. And he does something that is very typical of the rabbinic movement. He doesn't quote the Bible. He could have said, love your neighbor as yourself. Why didn't he say that? 100 years later, his colleague, Rabbi Akiva, would say that. Yeah, the most important commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. He doesn't say that. He says, what you find hateful, don't do to someone else. Now, you can explain it a lot of different ways. Maybe Hillel was thinking, loving your neighbor is not easy, but even if you don't love him, you could not try to upset him. So what you find hateful, don't do to him, even if you don't really love him. Even if you don't really like him, you still don't have to get him mad and angry. But it could also be that he wanted to do a classic rabbinic thing, which was give a commentary on the Bible, and the commentary is of equal or maybe even greater importance than the Bible itself. In any case, that's how he answered it. Here's my blue comment on that. Would you say these things? Usually when we're talking nasty about, we're trash talking somebody, the person's not standing in front of you, right? We're too chicken to do that. I don't want to say how horrible I think you are to your face, so I don't say it to your face, I say it to my friend's face. Remember how horrible this guy is over here? So the question is, would you say these things about that person if they were standing in front of you? Think about the person and what they're thinking, and would you say it the way you're saying it, or would you tone it down about 20 notches? How would you express your disagreement with them if they were standing there? Would you want them to say those things about you? Okay, that's commandment number 2. What is hateful to you, do not do to others. The next thing comes from a colleague of Rabbi Akiva's, Ben Azai. Notice his name is also not rabbi. He was during a generation of rabbis, so the fact that he's not Rabbi Ben Azai, by the way, he's not even known by his name. Right? Ben Azai doesn't mean his name was Benjamin. Ben Azai means his father's name was Azai. He's Ben Azai. He's the son of Azai. His first name is not as important as the last his father's name. And he's not a rabbi. He was never ordained. Nevertheless, he was considered a scholar, and many of his statements are recorded in the Talmud. And he had the chutzpah to argue with Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest rabbis in the Talmud. Rabbi Akiva says the most important commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. And Ben Azai said, you know what? I got a better one for you. Go back to Genesis, and you'll see there that every human being is created in God's image. He doesn't explain himself, but in the Midrash it's later explained that what he had in mind was, if you want to trash talk somebody, you should look into their eyes, and you should see that spark of the holiness in that person's eyes, and then say what you want to say. And that doesn't, regardless of this person's, obviously, their color or their religion or the country they're from or their sexual orientation, whatever it is, every human being is created in the image of God and deserves our ultimate respect and dignity because we're all created in God's image. And Ben Azai said that is the most important statement in the entire Bible. Number 4 comes from Avot, Pirkei Avot, a statement of wise sayings of our elders. And this one is about Hillel who said, be of the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace. Now, I didn't understand this when I'd heard this, when I was in college or whatever, but, you read a lot of stuff, and Aaron they're talking about here is Moses' brother. You probably knew that. I was too dumb to know that. Aaron is Moses' brother they're talking about. And you may wonder, well, what did Aaron do to deserve this high praise, that he loved peace and pursued peace? Doesn't seem like it so much in the Torah. I think that they may have gotten this idea from the idea that Aaron is, after all, after getting the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai, Moses goes up the mountain. We're going to do this tomorrow, by the way. We're going to reenact that tomorrow. Moses goes up the mountain, and he's gone for a few days, and right away the people want a replacement. And Aaron goes along with it and helps them to build a golden calf, which is pretty outrageous, right? So why does Aaron do that? And I guess maybe in that story the rabbis see that, well, he was just trying to calm everybody down, to hold them together long enough till Moses could get back. But anyway, whatever, whether it's that story or some other story, there's actually a story on the second page. You see the little red type over there. Avot de Rabbi Natan is a little tractate that's sort of a commentary, a pseudo-commentary on Avot. And there it describes the story about Aaron, which we won't go into tonight because I only have 12 more minutes. And so anyway, there's a story that's told about Aaron, about how he would promote kindness and he would pursue peace between two people who didn't like each other. In any case, Hillel said you should be of the disciples of Aaron and use him as a role model, loving peace and pursuing peace. It's not enough just to love peace. You have to actually go out and pursue it and try and make it happen, even in a situation where people, again, may be violently disagreeing with each other, maybe have, strong opinions about something, but you still have to find a way to pursue peace and try and reconcile them. Then in another place in Pirkei Avot, a surprising quotation from Shammai, which is why I put question mark, exclamation mark. I just told you the stories of Hillel and Shammai, right? Shammai was the one who supposedly was not as nice and friendly and was a little putting off and was kind of abrupt with people. Hillel was the kind, welcoming person. But what does Shammai say in Pirkei Avot? Receive everyone with a cheerful countenance. This is from the guy who sometimes maybe didn't follow his own advice. In here I insert in the blue, smile. Right? You're having a disagreement. Try to remember that you're really friends, you're really neighbors, you're really supposed to love each other. Smile. Make a joke, not a mean one. Unfortunately, lots of jokes are mean, right? What makes them funny is we're all in on it. We know that other guy is the bad guy, and that's what the joke is. Don't do that. Make a joke that's kind of lighthearted a little bit to lighten up the mood. That often will help you get around a tense moment. Kind of a little bit of that. Anyway, that's Shammai's advice. Number 6, judge everyone with the scale tipped in their favor. Another passage from Avot. That is to say, give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Try to understand where she or he is coming from, what she or he is feeling. Don't assume that the other person has nefarious intentions. That's unfortunately something that happens all too often in public discourse today. It's those other guys. They're out to destroy America. They're trying to ruin the country. They're going to subvert us all, enslave us all. They're trying to take over the world, right? If you hear stuff like that, you have to take a step back and think about, is that really what these people want? Half the country, we are about half divided, right? Where it's almost like 50-50 in the country. Half the people in this country want to destroy the other half? I certainly hope not. So what are their intentions? What are they trying to think? Explore that, find out. Don't assume things. Okay, number 7, don't hate your sibling in your heart. Comes right after you should love your neighbor as yourself, right? There's the converse, also from Leviticus, don't hate your sibling in your heart. We're all siblings. That is to say, we're all descendants of Adam and Eve. So even if the text originally meant literally your kinsmen, which would have referred only to Jews, nevertheless, kinsmen can be taken in a more expansive sense because we are all human beings. And so we should not hate each other in our hearts. Number 8 is a story which you may have heard. It's a very famous story in the Talmud. You may know that in the Talmud, very few women, unfortunately, are quoted. Very few women are noted as being scholars. That was kind of the nature of the society back then. However, there is a few of them, and one in particular is very well noted. Rabbi Meir had a wife whose name was Beria. And Beria was such a scholar that sometimes, it says in the Talmud, people would go to their home and to ask a question of the great Rabbi Meir, some matter of Jewish law. And if he wasn't home and she answered the door, they'd ask her because they figured whatever she said was just as good as whatever he said. So here's this, it's an amazing story where she chides her husband. By the way, there's a number of stories about Beria in the Talmud. They're all brilliant. She's a brilliant woman. But in any case, the story is told that Rabbi Meir had some people who were troubling him one day, or maybe for a few months. By the way, the Talmud is full of euphemisms, and this is clearly one of those times when they're using euphemistic language. Troubling him must have meant they were trying to kill him or destroy him in some way, because he, in turn, it's like if they were just like calling him names or something, but he ends up praying to God that they should die. So that's how you know that this is not just calling him names or something. There's something going on there pretty serious, and the Talmud is being euphemistic about it. So he comes to a certain part of the prayers where we believe that God particularly listens to our prayers in the prayer book. We'll talk about that another time. And he prays that God should kill them, basically. His wife, one day, Beria, overhears him reciting his prayers and how God should kill these people. And when he's done praying, because she knows enough not to interrupt him, she's done praying, she says to him, "My husband, how can you pray that somebody should die? Who are you? And you shouldn't be praying for the death of anyone. Look, if these people are troubling you, why don't you pray that they should be enlightened, that they should turn away from doing evil and do good? They should repent. They should become nice people." And Rabbi Meir took his wife's advice, and as the Talmud records, it was a happy ending. The people ceased to bother him in the future. But from this we learn a very, very important rule, a very important principle. Don't pray for the death of your enemies, or even, something slightly less than death, torture or something. Right? And I'm not kidding. In the public discourse today, you hear all kinds of insane things. Don't pray for these things. This is not appropriate, right? You should pray that other people should become a little more enlightened, perhaps, a little more open-minded, try to see things from different points of view. Maybe they can learn how to behave better, and maybe we can come to some kinds of compromise. I know compromise has also become a nasty word in this country. I'm not exactly sure how that happened, but in any case, hopefully we can come to some compromises. Don't pray for the death of your enemies. Now there's another famous passage in the Talmud. You may know that Hillel and Shammai became these two great schools of thought, kind of, if we were to make an analogy to American society today, kind of like, in a way, sort of similar to Democrats and Republicans. Yeah, so we had Democrats and Republicans, we had Hillelites and Shammaites, the two parties in the Congress, which was then called the Sanhedrin, right? And it turned out that whenever they would have disputes, which was pretty much every day, some things never change, when they would have disputes and then they would take a vote, the Hillelites always won. Probably because they were friendlier or whatever, but anyway, the Talmud records that they won, and here's what it says about why they always won. So it's recorded that the school of Hillel, and this is from the Talmud, I give you the source at the end. It's recorded that the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai disputed for 3 years over whose view was correct in matters of Jewish law, and then they heard a voice from heaven. Don't you wish that could happen in real life? Congress should get a voice from heaven. Idiots, this is what you should be doing, right? We should be so lucky. Anyway, a voice from heaven shouts out, it's called a bat kol. A voice from heaven shouts and announces that both views are the words of the living God. They're both right. That's a very Jewish idea, right? I put in the blue notes over here. That means that there may have been some truth on both sides, right? They're not completely, neither one's completely right, but there's some element of truth on both sides, and we should admit that up front. That also helps to make for compromises. Nevertheless, the voice in heaven said, "But the law is in accordance with the view of the school of Hillel." So immediately the Talmud asks, well, why, if they're both right, should God side with Hillel? And so the answer given is for the following things. I put little arrows next to them so that we'll note them all. The first one that I wanted to point out in the preamble there was that they both were the words of God. They both had some element of truth. That's an important thing to remember. But Hillel was kind. So don't be nasty when you're arguing with your opponent. First of all, you will never get anybody persuaded to your point of view when you're nasty to them. It's a little thing about psychology, you know? You're nasty to somebody's nasty to you, you're going to like, nah, 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 I'm not listening to you, right? So that's not a good way to try and get somebody to understand your point of view. So don't be nasty or resort to name calling, which unfortunately happens all too often. You should be kind to the other side. Number two, you should be modest. That is, humility is a worthy trait in a debate. Be open to listening to the other side. Listening is a very important skill. You know, the old saying goes, it was a generation or two before me, maybe longer. I haven't Googled it. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? So we should be listening twice as often as we're speaking, right? So listen carefully to what the other person is saying and accept that you may not have all the truth, right? Remember, go back to point 1. There's some element of truth on both sides. So listen to what that element of truth is. So modesty. Number 3, they studied their own position. That is, and this is really important today. By the way, it's going to get much crazier in the coming election season, I'm afraid. You know, with artificial intelligence, you know, you can take a picture of somebody and make a whole video of that person and then make a voice sounds just like their voice and their mouth is moving just like they're talking, and they're going to say all kinds of horrible things, and you're going to say, oh, wow, this guy's really terrible, and it's all fake. We're going to have to get a lot smarter, just saying. In any case, study your own position. That doesn't mean like QAnon says, oh, go look it up. And if anybody here is a QAnon person, I'd like to talk to you afterwards. But really look it up and look at real sources. Real sources, people who know what they're talking about. Be sure when you're looking at a story, you can find anything, right? That's the trouble with Google. You want to make sure you've researched your position and you know that what you're relying on is actually somehow closely related to the truth. Again, nobody's going to have the whole truth. Nobody's going to get the truth 100% correctly, but you want to go to a source that's going to give you what that person at least believes really is the truth, and they're basing it on something real, like science. That's become a bad word in some circles also lately. So study both your own position, know your arguments really, really well. And they also, next bullet point, knew the position of the school of Shammai. Yeah, now this is the really hard part. You've got to go to all those whacked out websites that are putting out all kinds of false information because far too many people are succumbing to that these days. If you want to have an argument with somebody, you want to have a hope of convincing them, you should at least know what they're reading. I have a hard time doing this because sometimes it's just so nutty, I just, you know, I have to have a drink. But anyway, that's not a bad idea, actually. All right, anyway, you have to know what the other side is reading. You have to know what the other side is reading. You have to look at it, you have to understand it, you have to know how to answer it. And Hillel people did that. Yeah, now we can turn the page. By the way, I put in there in boldface type in the blue, do not intentionally mischaracterize the other side's point of view. Boy, does that happen all the time now, right? I won't give details because we'll get into an argument. But you'll see mischaracterizing, right? Oh, those people, they believe this whacked out thing. Well, go look it up. They don't actually believe that. They have a much more modest view if you look at what they actually say. So don't put out a straw man. It's called a straw man in the argument. You make a fake position so you can beat it up. Okay, so be careful for that. And finally, Hillel cited the opposing view first. And this is consistent in the Talmud. Whenever the Talmud would cite the different perspectives, the losing side always went first because we want to give deference to this other point of view, even if we're going to disagree with it. So I conclude this section with, an argument should be an attempt to try and persuade others to your point of view. By the way, if you want to see a good argument, Monty Python did a whole sketch on this. Highly recommended, particularly if you have a sense of humor. Yeah, I didn't come here for an argument. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Just Google argument sketch, Monty Python. It's a great sketch. And in the argument that they have, actually, something very similar to this is what one of the guys says. An argument is supposed to be an attempt to try and persuade others to your point of view, while trying to understand their point of view, which may also have some element of truth in it. It should not be an effort to stoke the fury and frustration of those people who already agree with you, and that happens a lot now. By the way, news media, I don't care what channel you're watching, if you're watching a commercial news channel, which is 99% of them right now, they're all trying to get sponsors. Sponsors want to see eyeballs. How do you get eyeballs? You get people angry. Just know that whatever channel you're watching, they are trying to make you angry. So you'll come back tomorrow night and get angry again. It's just a fact of how it works today. So, you're not supposed to try and stoke the fury and frustration of those who already agree with you, nor are you trying to vent your anger and rage against your opponents, right? Neither one of those things is productive. You want to try and reach some kind of an understanding, right? And again, if these things were easy, I wouldn't be standing here today, right? And we wouldn't be having this problem 25 years after I wrote this in the first place. They're not easy, and not easy for me either. But, you know, this is, if we want to have a hope to try and create comedy somehow, this is what we have to do. C-O-M-I-T-Y, not comedy like C-O-M-E-D-Y, you know. Comedy is good, by the way, but, you know, anyway. All right. Another thing to think about, another way to think about this is to ask, what do you seek to accomplish in this argument or discussion? Do you want to declare victory? Is that your goal? You want to declare victory so you can vanquish the other side? Or are you seeking to understand the other and to be understood? Hopefully, in order to arrive at some higher truth. So this is very hard to bear in mind, especially in the midst of a heated argument. It's even harder to apply. Okay, and the last bit of advice comes from Pirkei, from the Avot of Rabbi Natan. Do I still have time? Yes? Okay, I'm good? Okay, this last one. This is great advice. This is really, really important advice. If you have done some minor wrong to another person, think of it as a big thing. In other words, we may not think, you know, I didn't say hello to that guy at Kiddush the other day. I actually got a call about that once. You didn't say hello to me. Well, oh, sorry, you know, whatever. I didn't see you, okay? But anyway, if you have done something that you think is a minor wrong to someone else, make a big apology because it obviously hurt them. They saw it as a big deal, and how they perceive it is important. So make a big apology. If you think you've done some big deal for somebody, some great benefit, you've given them some big thing, don't think of it as a big deal. Think of it as a small thing because, you know, after we do a big thing, we're expecting a big thank you note. Expect a big thank you note, you could be disappointed. Then you're going to be really angry. And send me a thank you note. We don't really care. So just think of it, you know what? They may not have saw it that way. Maybe they don't have they lost track of whatever. Don't get so worked up. You did it because, like your parents said, it was the right thing to do. You weren't looking for the thank you. You weren't working for the payback, right? You did it because it was the right thing to do. Don't expect a big thank you. On the other hand, if you've done something bad, if somebody else has done something really bad to you, try and minimize it in your mind, right? Because the more you maximize it and ruminate about it and work yourself up about it, the angrier you're going to get and the less you're going to be willing to even accept an apology if you even get one. So try and minimize the thing that you think was a big wrong that somebody did to you. Try to think of it as a small thing. On the other hand, if someone does you a minor favor, you should consider it like a big deal and go out of your way to say thank you. What does all of this mean? We tend to see things through our own nearsighted, eyes and vision, right? We tend to see things from our point of view, and these are ways to counterbalance that nearsighted perspective so that we can balance it out a little more. And with that, we have the 10 Commandments of Civility. Good luck to us all.
We cantors are so multi-talented. Chag Sameach. I am Cantor Rachel Goldman. I am the cantor here at Beth Yeshurun. These are my fantastic colleagues. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Cantor Kenny Fibush from Congregation Beth Israel.
And I'm Cantor Rollin Simmons from Congregation Emmanuel.
Yeah, we're good. I'll speak louder.
This is also a sound check.
Chag Sameach. It is such a joy to be here this evening to learn together as we celebrate Shavuot. And it is certainly a joy anytime I get to sing with other cantors. So I am so grateful to be here with Cantor Fibush and Cantor Goldman this evening and with all of you. We thought we would sing selections on the theme of angels. We began with the words of Baruch Hu, our call to worship. This prayer comes after we have warmed up with some preliminary prayers, which vary depending on the time of day and the day of the week.
And it is at that moment when it really matters that we have our minyan, a group of at least 10, that they are all present. And we are now calling to our community, are you ready to pray? Are you ready to lift yourself up from the ordinary bustling chaos of the day to find some holiness, to pause and to be grateful, to take a breath? We are like angels shedding our dusty human clothes and calling to each other. Are you ready to find some holiness?
So now we sing the familiar melody of Shalom Aleichem by Israel Goldfarb. This song comes from the 17th century Kabbalists of northern Israel and was based on the Talmudic teaching that when we leave the synagogue on Shabbat, we are accompanied by two ministering angels, one good and one evil. If they find the person's home prepared for Shabbat, the good angel declares, "May it be your will that it shall be like this for another Shabbat. And the evil angel answers against his will, Amen. If the home is not prepared, the reverse happens. The evil angel voices a wish for it to be this way for another week, and the good angel responds, Amen. Perhaps a lesson that if we take the time to appreciate the gift that is Shabbat, it will help us to acknowledge the holiness in our lives, in ourselves, and in those around us.
Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Asharet, Malachei Elyon, Elyon, Bimelech HaMelachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Mochem L'Shalom, Malachei Asharet, There is a tradition of praying the bedtime Shema at night before we go to sleep. A main theme within this set of prayers is asking for protection through the night. I was just at a song leading conference called Havana Shira, and I was learning from many amazing people. One of them was Cantor Ellen Dreskin, who was teaching about a Hasidic idea that when we go to sleep, our souls leave our body and go to, as Cantor Dreskin put it, a soul party, where they get rejuvenated and re-enlivened before somehow finding their way back to us and restoring themselves within us in the morning.
So as we are asking for protection, we call upon 4 angels. Rabbi Rachel Berenblatt teaches about these 4 angels. One on the right is Michael, which in Hebrew means, who is like you, God? In simple words, wonder, she says. On the left is Gabriel, which means God's strength, or strength. In front is Uriel, which means God's light. We think of just light. Behind is Raphael, God's healing, simply comfort. And above us and surrounding us, ever present with us, is the Shekhinah, the immanent divine presence.
Wonder, strength, light, comfort. May these be with you as you close your eyes tonight. May you feel the Shekhinah wrap you up like a warm blanket, and may your dreams be sweet.
May our right hand bring us closer to our godliness.
May our left hand give us strength to face each day.
And before us may our visions light our paths ahead, and behind us may well be the ray. All around us is shared
So we close this evening with one of our favorites. If you were at my concert in May or in March, you heard a bunch of our young adult women sing this as well. This is a song that helps us to remember that there is power and holiness in singing together.
This is the sound of one voice, one spirit, one voice, the sound of one who makes a choice. This is the sound of one voice. This is the sound of one voice. This is the sound of voices too. The sound of me singing with you, helping each other to make it through. This is the sound of voices too. This is the sound of voices too. This is the sound of voices three, singing together in harmony, surrendering to the mystery. This is the sound of voices three. This is the sound of voices three. This is the sound of all of us, singing with love and the will to trust. Leave the rest behind, it'll turn to dust. This is the sound of all of us. This is the sound of all of us. Ooh, 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 ooh. זה הצליל שכל אחד, עם אחד, שיר אחד, שבת אחים גם יחד. This is the sound of one voice. This is the sound of one voice.
Light up Rabbi Gideon.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Gideon Estes from Orami. I appreciate those of you who have the stamina. I have the honor of being the penultimate teacher this evening. So it was very interesting that we opened our evening with my amazing colleagues talking about some of our modern prophets, Viktor Frankl. Later on that we had Superman. Rabbi Scott talked about Hannah and Miriam, some of our prophetesses. And we really got to explore some of the meanings of what it is for prophecy. And that's what I want to talk to you about this evening, is what we really understand by prophets in the Jewish tradition. And my inspiration for that comes from Heschel's seminal work, The Prophets, of where Heschel offers a framework for understanding the prophets. Because I think that we suffer initially by being products of American society, which by default is mostly a Christian society, that we have the default understanding of prophet of being, oh, simply God's mouthpiece. Or we think of prophecy as we get it from Hellenistic culture, of that prophecies are kind of telling of the future, the casting of the signs. That's not what prophecy is in the Jewish tradition. The prophets are not some separated out kind of deep intellectual. The prophets, by sake of their prophecy, are forced to have the mindset and the emotion of God at being disquieted by the suffering of people, and then that leads to a cause of action. It's very interesting. What Heschel argues is that the prophets cannot be understood. He was it's like back up a little bit. The original work of the prophets was written in German, published in Poland just before World War II as Heschel's doctoral thesis. He then wrote his own translation, which was then released, of kind of modernizing it. But in his introduction to the prophets he rails against the approach of philosophy that he encountered as a student, where it was this cold distancing of ideas and not actually having philosophy relate to actual lives. What Heschel demanded was action. Is that the call of the prophet is to be grounded in this world. It's not ethereal. It's very concrete. The other thing is that he got derided is that when you looked at other academics of his time, they would view the prophets in these sterile kinds of contexts and try to understand, well, what might lead them to think this, and as if they didn't live in society. But Heschel tells us the prophets still had their individuality, they had their lives, and their minds melded with God. And so that they gave voice in the human idiom to the ideals that God wishes to hold us. For us in our day, we are required to allow ourselves to be moved by the exaltations of the prophets. The prophets tell us to look at the world and not be apathetic. Things that are trivial to us, of where we can tolerate certain levels of injustice, to the eye of the prophet, are intolerable. The prophet holds us to a very high standard, and it's going to make us feel bad. And at the same time, also give us hope. Because it can be contradictory. The prophet lives in the worlds of paradox. really easy to look the other way. Unfortunately for us, as Jews, we're not allowed to have that luxury. We're supposed to care. The age of prophecy may have ended with the destruction of the temple, but we still have the words of the prophets. And by reading the words of the prophets, we have an understanding of the value structure of God. And we have to understand that understanding the will of God to actualize the vision of justice and betterment for the world is to be internalized with our own experiences. That's incredibly powerful and enabling. We are to partner with God in helping make God's vision manifest in the world. What Heschel teaches us is that we all have the potential to be prophets. God may not speak directly to you, but we can hear the echoes of God's value when we read the prophets. I had a lot of quotes I was going to share, but one that I really like is this. Why and for what purpose was Abraham chosen to become a great and mighty nation? To be a blessing to all the nations of the earth? Not because he knew how to build pyramids and altars and temples, but in order that may he charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. Righteousness is foremost among the things that God asks of men. Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, let not the mighty man glory in his might, let not the rich man glory in his riches, but let him who glories glory in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who does kindness, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, says the Lord. And that's from Jeremiah 9:23 to 24. We can know God. It's not about celebrating how great we are. It's about seeing people that are suffering and working to abate that suffering. It's about incorporating all these lessons that we've heard from all these amazing scholars earlier this night, and we'll hear from the next scholar who will follow me, of how to follow in civil discourse, how to revel in our identity as Jews, how to be inspired. God can act through us. If you want to know what God asks, all you need to do is look to the tradition. But don't look at it just clinically. Feel it. Let it touch your soul. One of the things that Heschel talks about is that in order to do things properly, is you really need to connect with God, right? We say to serve God with all our heart, all our might, and all our soul. What that means is that it's not compartmentalized. We allow that clarion call to fill our whole being. Allow yourself to be bothered by injustice. Allow yourself to get angry at it, to say, hey, we can do better. It's like the ultimate expression of quixoticness, right? There's tons of windmills to tilt at. But we can't give up. And I think that that's part of the power. And when we really seek on that, then we're letting God into our minds and into our hearts, and we're sharing some of that passion. So my wish for all of us on this Shavuot as we relive Revelation is that we're reminded that we hear not only with our ears, but that we also hear with our soul, with our heart, and with our minds. Thank you, Chag Sameach. And now it's my pleasure to turn over to Rabbi Steve Gross from the Houston Congregation for Reform Judaism.
What a beautiful night. It's so special to be here with colleagues from congregations. Thank you very much to Beth Yeshurun for hosting this. Now, I am the only thing between you and your cheesecake. At this point, you've listened to some amazing lessons from great teachers, beautiful voices of song, all inspiring. And you have been learning all night, and I'm 100% sure that your focus is beginning to shift. You see, our brains can only take so much. It's just natural. We can't help it. What goes on in the brain is chemical. And it's just part of how the brain works. Now, I'm not a brain scientist in any shape or form, but for the sake of cheesecake, I will oversimplify this explanation of this first part of my talk on brain. Consider it an act of mercy. There are two parts of the brain for us to consider tonight. The first part is the thinking part of the brain, which is called the cerebral cortex. That's where we have logic, that's where we make our judgments, that's where your brain has been most of tonight. And then there's the emotional center of the brain, which is referred to as the limbic system. The emotional center of the brain and our emotions are primarily functioning out of a very small part of that limbic system called the amygdala. The amygdala is the storehouse for our emotional memories and plays a key role in our emotional responses to stimuli. The amygdala plays a key role in decision-making that is connected to our feelings of fear and our feelings of pleasure. And in recent years, it has become apparent that this part of the brain is also associated with our eating behaviors, which is where the cheesecake comes in. In this capacity, the amygdala is responsible for detecting the intensity of flavor and induces our desire for more. It's what moves us to overindulge because we connect that with comfort and a sense of just joy. So here's what happens. Our brains get some kind of stimulus from outside, and it either goes to the thinking part of the brain or the emotional part of the brain. And if that stimulus comes in and it's so strong in the emotional, and we've all had this before, we stop thinking, right? You feel anger or frustration, and all logic disappears. It's all instantaneous. It's unfurled as floods of hormones are released into the body that causes a physical, emotional response. The surge of energy prepares us for a flight or fight response. And the grip of these chemicals in our bodies is extremely overpowering. It is at this point that we say things and we do things that we may later regret. Now, here's the most important part of this flowchart of chemicals from our brain, and that is that these chemicals that are released only last about 90 seconds. Think about that. We get all this intensity, and it's all released, and then after 90 seconds, it's pretty much done. And what is the significance of this? Well, it's important because after 90 seconds, we have a choice. In other words, after 90 seconds, the thinking side of our brain, that logical part, the part that we can start to resume normal interactions, is available to us again. Now, why is this 90-second rule so important to us, and how does it impact the world around us, and why is it Jewish at all? Well, it's important because we need not be slaves to our amygdala. Whether it is our desire for cheesecake, or having patience with our children, or tempering our reactions to things in the world when we are stressed or frustrated, or when things don't go our way. After 90 seconds of chemical rush, it starts to ebb, and we begin to have control. Enough with the brain science, and now for the Jewish. There is a Hasidic teaching that says the mind shapes the heart. This adage echoes the lessons from our neuroscientists. While each of these disciplines may approach the human condition from very different perspectives, both Judaism and brain science understand human emotions to be controlled by our brains. Both perspectives argue that most of the time, we can exercise choice in our reactions to the stimuli that bombard us every second of our lives. Indeed, it all begins with the brain, and the goal from a Jewish perspective is to temper those responses with our values and our beliefs and our practices and our customs. The primary tool we use in Judaism to control these impulses involves a shift in our mindset. Blessings, customs, holidays, almost anything that is of the religious endeavor in any faith are primarily there to try to help us shift our mindset. The kippah that we wear on our head is there to help us move to a different way of thinking about space and our presence in it. A bracha helps us recognize the godliness in any moment. Kaddish helps us shift to a place of comfort. Mindful living is one of the most important aspects of and goals of faith in general and Judaism in particular. If we master a strategy that begins with mindfulness, we can go a long way in helping us generate harmony in our relationships and promoting peace in the world around us. What is mindfulness? And how can mindfulness help each of us refrain from overreacting or overindulging in about 10 minutes? Well, looking back over the course of our lessons tonight, it looks like we have some pretty great building blocks. Each of the rabbis from different perspectives helped us find meaning and an element of mindfulness through various aspects of Jewish faith. So it's up to me here to kind of wrap it up. And my goal is to help us see that Jewish mindful living is something that we already do. We do it all the time. And we just need to embrace the practice, recognize that we have the capacity to do it, and then apply it wherever we can. Where do we find such mindful living in our everyday lives? Well, I would argue that we experience it and practice it every single day in Houston traffic. In fact, the idea of this talk tonight originated while I was in bumper-to-bumper traffic trying to get to an important meeting. And I had to change lanes from the fast lane all the way to my exit. And I thought about this, that we could kind of use this as a way, to kind of a guided meditation. I don't want it to cause too much stress because it can give you PTSD. But a guided meditation, just how much mindfulness goes into just simply changing lanes. Imagine you are driving in bumper-to-bumper traffic, which we do all the time. It's stop and go. Your speed varies from 5 miles an hour to 20 miles an hour. The freeway is full, packed with cars. Cars are unevenly spaced. And now we need to figure out how to change lanes. We need to move at the speed of traffic, and yet it's changing constantly. What do? Well, first we turn our blinker on, give others the notice that we are about to change lanes, right? We have to gauge our speed. We have to gauge the speed of the cars coming next to us, from behind us, from the side of us. We have to check our rear view mirror, our side mirror. It's all going on simultaneously. It's not an easy task to do. My 15-year-old's trying to do it right now, and it terrifies me to even be in the car with him. All of this is going on, and you need to just aggressively but also cautiously move into that next lane while keeping an eye on the car in front of you lest it stops short. All of this is done with intention. All of it is done with thought. All of it is done with direction and extreme caution. One misstep in any of these actions is a car wreck, right? This is exactly how mindfulness works. When we are able to carefully consider our words before we say them, our actions before we do them, our habits before we repeat them, we are being mindful. It is not easy, but just consider how our interactions with the world would improve if everyone tried to do everything in life with the same kind of calculated, cautious, intentional, mindful action that we do when we try to change lanes on a crowded freeway. The truth is that our abilities to interact with each other become more effective when we start to slow down and take the time to think things through before we act. Remember, the mind shapes the heart. When we think about it, a little time goes a long way in almost every endeavor in life. Time usually makes most things a little bit better. And whenever we allow something to sit for a little bit before we act on it, before we eat it, it is usually worthwhile. Consider a good steak. You take the steak out, you don't eat it immediately, you let it sit. Let it sit, let it rest. Cheese is much better served when it becomes room temperature. Red wine is enjoyed when it's decanted and a little bit of air gets to it. This is true in our daily interactions as well. One of the greatest challenges in everyone's life is exercising the capacity to sit with information or consider an idea before we react. Our world has become so hyper-connected, so dependent on immediate responses through email and text messaging and tweeting and whatever other things are going on that I don't even know about. But we're so dependent on that immediate response that it puts pressure on us to respond before we've had time to let it rest. And just as it is when we navigate traffic, being mindful of every step in our response goes a long way to avoid disasters. Anyone who has ever taken the time to carefully craft a delicately worded email or letter on a sensitive topic, can attest to the fact that there are a lot of factors that play into one's wishes to avoid controversy or offense. Words must be carefully chosen. Phrases like, "Don't take this the wrong way," or "Please don't read any kind of judgment in my message," or emojis like smiley faces or that kind of face, or LOL, whatever. Those things go a long way in helping us mitigate and shape a tone. Just imagine how much better our communications would be if we employed the kind of time and care in all of our interactions. There is a powerful lesson which comes from the teachings of a Chinese philosopher, Lao Tzu, who taught the following: watch your words, watch your thoughts, for they become your words. Watch your words, for they become your actions. Watch your actions, for they become your habits. Watch your habits, for they become your character. Watch your character, for it becomes your destiny. The value of being mindful and the path to its development in our daily interactions can come from countless sources. It can come from the streets of Houston traffic. It can come from teachings from our sages, like the mind shapes the heart. It can be proven through neuroscience, which reminds us that it only takes 90 seconds for our emotional amygdala response to ebb, to make room for the logical responses of the cerebral cortex. But whatever the source may be, the truth is this, that it's important. It's an important discipline of becoming mindful. It really demands one primary strategy, and that is slowing down and creating a gap between the stimulus and the response. Someone mentioned Viktor Frankl earlier. One of the lessons was on Viktor Frankl, who founded logotherapy, whose famous book, Man's Search for Meaning, tells the story of how he survived the Holocaust by finding personal meaning in the experience itself. He taught the following. He argued, between stimulus and response, there is space. And in that space, there is a choice on how to respond. By slowing down and increasing the span of time between our feelings and our actions, we increase our capacity to see, hear, understand, and embrace the world around us with more intention and greater meaning. This span of time need not be long. Science says only 90 seconds, which is just about as long as it takes to take in and out a few dozen breaths. So as we wrap up our learning session tonight, I challenge each of us to take the following to heart. Before we react on the emotions we feel, pause, breathe, allow 90 seconds to transpire in order to reclaim that rational thinking part of our brains. Ask, I wonder what's going on here that leads or that has led to this situation or crisis. Remain curious, concerned, and interested. And then, only then, begin the starting point for the engagement. Thank you very much, and I know that the cheesecake is just a few moments away.
Thank you, Rabbi Gross. Perfect way to end. And let's give a big round of applause to all those who participated tonight and all those who planned everything. So the over was, with this last past 11 p.m., I think everyone betted the over. No one betted the under. We are way early, but that's okay. We know we did have Rabbi Lyon, hopefully we'll refuah shalem out of him. But most importantly, I think that it was a beautiful night of learning Torah, of a lot of meaning and a lot of things to take home. So continue to take those lessons, continue to study, and let us be grateful that we can celebrate together as a community tonight. So enjoy the cheesecake and ice cream bar. It's right outside the doors, all the way down here to your right in the fine atrium. And Chag Sameach, everyone.
Check, check, check. Check, check. Check, check, check.
Something. And they be paying me big time at night. Is that right? Yeah, I've been icing it, man, for the last 3 weeks. I'm doing good.
So a little too far forward? Is that where it all?
Once it's straight, I mean.
No, I meant too far forward.
Oh, you want to come back up some more?
I don't know. Is this where it normally goes? It seems like it's.
Yeah, it seems like it, yeah.
Can we just push it?
No, you can't, man. No, this thing here. I thought can we get a clear one or something? A new one or something.
Heavy.
Oh, a new one, yeah. I thought they were gonna start doing this stuff, man. This.
Oh.
I thought once Council leave, they ain't gotta do it no more.
No, Strauss is the one that wants this. Guys, I'm not here in the morning. I'll be here tomorrow afternoon. I got service in here in the morning.
No. I'm not gonna be, but everything is set for them to go on.
Yeah.
Jimmy's wanting to be here.
You shouldn't have to do anything here. have to do anything with the audio in here. Check, check, check.